So in this lesson we're going to be covering the classical English and classical liberal philosopher Mary Wollstonecraft, known commonly as she's the mother of Mary Shelley, and she was one of the more influential advocates of formal equality under law for women in the Enlightenment. Obviously she was not part of the suffrage movement, as women technically could still vote until 1832, and I'm going to be doing an entire series on that, as I have become somewhat of an expert on the suffrage movement and the suffragettes, and whether or not they advanced or hindered the campaign to achieve female suffrage in the years prior to the First World War. So, let's get into it. Mary Wollstonecraft lived between 1759 and 1797. A very short life for a very intelligent lady. Wollstonecraft and the education of women. Mary Wollstonecraft believed that in order for a state to run at maximum efficiency, it must educate its women. This is because women are the primary caregivers of the next generation. So, as a means to ensure that children are well cultivated, their mothers must be educated so as to teach their children the proper virtues. Wollstonecraft states that the lack of education available to women leaves them stunted as they enter adulthood. Mothers with the mental capacity of children will instill unfounded prejudices in their progeny, which will hinder progress when the next generation takes up the reins of government. So essentially that means if they are not raising virtuous children and they're raising weak ones, it's not going to end well. There's the common saying, good times produce weak men. Weak men produce hard times, and hard times produce strong men, and strong men provide the good times for weak men to once again emerge. And essentially having women there as a way to ensure that the men grow up strong, and obviously the daughters as well, but essentially to ensure that the next generation have the proper virtues. As in the present day, we can see a lot of degeneracy emerging from the youth. Therefore, those whom raise the children in a time of such great proliferation as the Industrial Revolution ought to be educated. She also asserts that the education of women will improve men in the sense that it will force them to cultivate virtue in order to win their hearts. So essentially, if you've ever read Pride and Prejudice, if there's young and inexperienced, poorly educated women like Elizabeth Bennet's sister, they'll just go and run off with any old bloke, even if he's not particularly even if he's not a particularly good man. So essentially, by cultivating the women and making them more like the Elizabeth Bennet, it forces men to act less roguish, less irresponsibly, and essentially act more like Mr. Darcy, if that makes any sense. This is because uneducated women are more likely to succumb to their vices, and thus allow themselves to be seduced by the dandies they come into contact with. So, dandies are an interesting part of this historical period. They're essentially men who dressed very peacock-like, very flamboyantly to attract women, and they had like really fancy coats with massive shiny buttons. Mudlarkers, I know, prize these buttons as a fun little historical oddity, because they're very big and shiny, essentially just to catch the eye of young women. So this would effectively ruin a woman in Wollstonecraft's day, so it was vital that they preserve their chastity until marriage. Educating women would put men into a position where they would have to prove to a woman that he is worthy of marriage instead of a woman being forced into marriage for fear of ruin were she to have premarital intercourse with the lover in question. So essentially, if they are doing that kind of stuff before marriage, if at the day it's perceived to be like, oh, we don't like people that have done it before, and it's deemed irrespectable, so you wouldn't really marry them. So that kind of forced the women to marry their lover, even though they may not be particularly good. So she also believed that equal property rights for women would encourage such behaviour in men, as it kept a looming threat of divorce over their heads, thus demanding them to maintain their virtues. So they can't just start slacking, eating all the McDonald's stuff, getting fat and lazy, never doing any work. Keeps them on their toes. So an increase in the number of virtuous people in a society would benefit society as a whole. And obviously that is true. So educating women is essentially good for everyone. Wollstonecraft and natural rights. Mary Wollstonecraft believed that the lack of formal equality under the law for women seriously undermined the principles of the Enlightenment. This is because it infringed upon women's natural property rights and their right to self-autonomy, as society forced them to depend upon the protection of their lover, and thus demanded them to be subservient to him in order to maintain his protection. So essentially by making it so that women were dependent on the men, essentially gave men too much control. And if you're going to be thinking of relationships like a government, in a proper and functioning government, the branches should all be of equal size. So the legislature, executive, and judiciary should all have equal power to one another. And if you're thinking of that in a marriage, the man and woman must have equal power to one another in order to ensure the checks and balances. So the man is maintaining virtuous, he's still working hard, still exercising, and the woman doing her things, still looking after the children, improving on herself, educating the children, or working in the modern day, although there are problems to that, but it's not a conversation for today. This ties into her views on education, as she believed that education would be necessary for women to realise their potential as autonomous individuals. Wollstonecraft's personal life. Mary Wollstonecraft had an intriguing life, although it was tragically cut short when she died in childbirth. Her child was Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, and I've included a picture of her to the left. One of the pioneers of the sci-fi genre, one of my personal favourites, Robert Heinlein and Aldous Huxley, Isaac Asimov being very cool gents. So, she was an astute reader who had strong opinions of how society could be improved. She attempted to kill herself by throwing herself into the River Thames, but was fortunately resuscitated by one of the newly opened resuscitation offices that had opened on the Thames for people who had fallen in. Her works clearly influenced the suffrage movement of the 19th century, and she existed in a time when women were becoming more prominent in the political landscape, as Catherine the Great was on the Russian throne for most of her life. The opinions of Wollstonecraft also seem to have been echoed in the works of Jane Austen, whom displayed similar ideas to the ones I have stated in her most famous novel, Pride and Prejudice, as we discussed closer towards the beginning. So, that's it for Wollstonecraft. Let's just give a quick rundown of her famous works and core ideas. So, her famous works were a vindication of the rights of women and her collated letters, and her core ideas were formal equality under the law, classical liberalism, equality of opportunity, equal property rights, natural rights, and she was an advocate of mechanistic theory. So, that's it for Mary Wollstonecraft. We'll get on to some other political figures next time. Thank you.